Psychoanalysis and Philosophy, Writing of Humanity. Controversial and politically incorrect and counterintuitive, though it may seem, in the area of psychoanalysis and philosophy, severe limitations, constant limitations, almost eternal limitations of humanity that doesn't allow us to idealize humanity or future of humanity. This way of thinking, this philosophizing, this idea development has been in the area of psychoanalysis and philosophy for a long time. It has a historical tradition to it. Contrary to the utopians, there has been a strong anti-utopian tradition, less popular, more vilified, yet deep, profound, substantial. And today we'll take a look at these non-utopian traditions in the area of psychoanalysis and philosophy, and how what is pointed out by these non-utopian traditions plays out in the therapy room. Let us first look at the historical aspect of it. If we look at the classical scholastic philosophy of Western civilization, we come across Schopenhauer, Kant, Hegel, who write off in different ways humanity or the utopian possibilities of an individual. Schopenhauer is known to have a very pessimistic view of human nature. He is also known for pointing out the unconscious motivations of human nature. He is also known for pointing out the nature of things by virtue of the laws of nature, combining which Schopenhauer doesn't see how the suffering of this planet, especially human suffering, can be brought an end to, or in his words, life is a business that doesn't cover its expenses, and how to make it profitable. So Schopenhauer saw no way out, and like many others, he believed that neither human nature nor laws of nature, and together put, it makes what we call the nature of things. Nature of things cannot be transformed to a state where happiness will be more than suffering on this planet, especially human suffering. And therefore, the best way out was to take the Buddhist path of nirvana. So Schopenhauer wrote off not only the individual, but also the future of the race. In his opinion, there was no utopian possibility which can come true. And he described life as endless pain to a painful end. So that's how his pessimism gets formulated. So he had written of both the individual and humanity centuries back and prescribed the way out was the way out of the Buddhist nirvana. Immanuel Kant wrote of humanity in a more qualified way. He circumscribed the reach of thought. He circumscribed the knowability of human beings. That human beings can never know the thing in itself, and there was an unbridgeable, disjointed space, a gap, a gulf between the subject and the object. He also brought out the difficulty of foundation of morality, that there is no divine foundation of morality, there is no natural foundation of morality. It is a epistemological foundation inside the human mind, which stands as a foundation no matter how fragile, how incomplete, at times not convincing. So Kant circumscribed the riches of humanity in an epistemological and in a moral context. Hegel did it in a different way. He did not write of utopia for humanity, but the power was in the hands of a suprahuman order. The suprahuman order which was propelling the human race towards an absolute through the dialectic at an epistemological level and through possibly a dialectic at the social level. So Hegel's writing off of humanity was not writing off of human future, but writing off of the individual as being insufficient, incapable, without the spirit of the age, without the suprahuman push of history towards the absolute. In that sense, the individual was only a token occasion for a suprahuman force to unfold itself and manifest itself. So his writing off was more subtle, where humanity was no longer at the center, but suprahuman forces were at the center, using humanity beyond the control of humanity to propel it forward. So this writing off was a very qualified, very subtle writing off. It was not writing off of human future, but writing off of the individual and no guarantee of what the utopia would be like. It may be a suprahuman utopia in which human beings may be surpassed into another race. We don't know. So it was a more qualified writing out of the individual, although on the surface it looks like a promise of utopia. It's a promise of utopia, no doubt, but a utopia brought in by suprahuman forces, not by the individual, not by the race. In that sense, the race was involved. It was through the race it was happening, but not because of the race it was happening. Coming to Freud, the same thing happens in a different way. There is a famous correspondence between Freud and Einstein during the Second World War, in which Freud talks about why wars cannot be avoided, the madness of destruction and brutality cannot be avoided. And Freud points out that aggression, sadism, and domination These three forces in human nature are far too strong to be controlled or neutralized or sublimated by the forces of reason, love, empathy, or compassion. And this nature of things, in Freud's view, doesn't seem to have any solution at the fundamental level. In that sense, Freud becomes a pessimist and writes off any utopia because there is no solution at the fundamental level in the human mind. And everything outside is ultimately used by these fundamental motivations of the human mind. If they are not peaceful, not humane, not on the side of morality or good, the outer manifestation is going to be corresponding to. Lacan brings out this thing in a different way. He talks about the need for unconditional love and no way of getting it in society or from any individual. So human beings have a need for unconditional love from others, but nobody is capable of giving. So we have a desire which cannot be fulfilled at the most fundamental level. And this will keep us perpetually dissatisfied, perpetually in search, perpetually projecting a state of things we never had. And therefore, there are limits to what humanity can move in terms of happiness. So it is not the outside, but the inside in Lacanian terms that sets a limit to creating any utopia. Because the outside doesn't so much matter in this conceptualization. It is the inner desire for unconditional love and the primal inner state of fragmentation coming out of which happens by a mechanism which creates this whole problem. That there is nowhere to go to set right the primal problems. Buddha writes of humanity in the same way because in Indian spirituality and in all spiritual traditions, there are two paths, the path of the yes and the path of the no. The path of the yes says that individual can be perfected, the world can be perfected, there is a way out of the historical tragedy which has been on ever since we know it. And there is a way of making earth and heaven equal and one, or at least there is a way of being in the world and not suffer. So this is the path of yes. This is the path of Shakespeare, Sri Aurobindo, Krishna, and so on. And then there is the path of no. The path of no is the path of Schopenhauer. It is the path of Buddha. It is the path of Mahavira. So there are two paths, the path of yes and the path of no, both in psychoanalysis and in philosophy. And there are qualified paths like Freud and Lacan would not talk about leaving the world, but of a profound reality acceptance. It is a path of yes with a profound acceptance of no. A hybrid between the two. Shakespeare doesn't write of humanity, he calls it the crown of creation. So there is a counterpoint here, and he represents a full school which does not write of humanity. And this school, at its peak, is represented by Sri Aurobindo, who talks about a manifestation of the supramental and coming of a superhuman race post-humanity, which would have a radically different life than we have. And in the advent of the new race, not only the new race would have a fundamentally different hardware, but the laws of nature also would change. And so what we call the nature of things, the individual and the laws of nature outside both undergo fundamental change at the level of the hardware. Both the hardware and the operating system. If we have this idea of both those who write off and those who don't write off, and if we try to step back and reflect, what do we get? If we raise the standards fairly high, if we take into account our search for omnipotence and where we are relative to it, we inevitably come to the existential standpoint which writes off all utopia, which is on the side of a yes based on a profound no. And if we look at every day, it's not difficult to find out how easy it is to write off humanity. So unless we believe in a new nature of things like Sri Aurobindo, inevitably we come to the existential standpoint of a yes based on a profound no, kind of a standpoint of Freud and Lacan. We also realize in the everyday sense that man is trivial, never worthy of full assurance. And if we raise standards fairly high, and if we don't go into a future as promised by Sri Aurobindo or the Vedas, inevitably we have to write off humanity. The only way of not writing off humanity is to believe in the Vedic promise or Sri Aurobindo's promise of a new race and a new nature of things. The only hope, therefore, is in the transformation of man and nature, not in humanity as it is. Let us discuss a few terms to make this politically incorrect topic even more, slightly more clear. We move from something amorphous to clear. Humanity is a very amorphous word. Usually it is equated with goodness, with compassion, with selflessness, with nobility, with humaneness, so to say. But that is not a correct meaning of the word. If we move from amorphous state to a clear state, humanity is not a synonym of goodness. Humanity is everything that human beings do. It's a collection of that. And human beings do everything good, bad, and ugly. So the best of humanity is not humanity. The best of humanity, the average of humanity, and the worst of humanity, everything has to be put together to really truthfully define humanity. And humanity, like nature, is not beyond good and evil. Nietzsche says nature is beyond good and evil. I don't feel nature is beyond good and evil. Nature is both good and evil, and more evil than good at this point in time. Truthfully speaking, humanity is more averageness. Most individuals are average, governed by average desires and fears. When it comes to good qualities, nature is highly aristocratic and not democratic at all. IQ test of people is one example. If you look at it, it's a bell curve. And bell curve only is a statistical way of saying that most people are average and few are talented. And few are beyond all help. This comes up in statistical tests used by American Army. Jordan Peterson has made a good comment on this. He says, US Army is desperate for people. They have tried to train people with as low IQ as possible, but they realize below 85, 84 or 85 he mentions, below that level, it's virtually impossible to train people no matter how hard you try to train. And almost 10% of population falls in that category. So if we look at people who can't do anything, if you look at people who can barely do the simplest of things, and if you look at people who can do complicated things, there are very few. So the IQ tests make it very clear that neither everyone is equal nor everyone is good enough from a competence standpoint. It may be necessary for everyone to believe I am okay, you're okay, but from a competence standpoint, everyone is not okay. And most people live as slaves of their base impulses. And that is why we see the politics of the world as it is. This brings us to a more controversial point. Is writing of humanity for the good of humanity, or is it a pessimistic, angry impulse of annihilation? If we think of with a cool mind, if there is no promise of a new nature of things, a new individual and new laws of nature, then it is a very contingent thing to conclude. If history is going on a path where happiness is more than sadness or suffering, the business is covering up the cost and the enterprise is worth sustaining. But if it is not true and there is more pain than pleasure and no reasonable way of coming out of it, then it is better to write off a loss-making company and give a blank slate to nature to start off the experiment again. There is no point in seeing the enterprise of humanity as a sacred entity to be preserved forever for itself and not to subject this line of thinking to reasonableness. There is no point of perpetuating a hell forever. So there is no purpose in a painful perpetuating unless we see a definite way out, or we believe on the whole there is more pleasure than pain. So these are some of the aspects of writing of humanity, certain arguments from philosophical, psychological, and political, and in general social standpoint, how there are schools on each side and what are the reasons for writing of humanity. Now, how does this tragedy manifest in the mind? Coming to the aspect of the mind. Because the tragedy we are looking at is a fundamental existential tragedy. Essentially true over history, though in specifics it takes different intensity based on the historical times and the fate of the individual. So in the inner world, this tragedy, which comes out from the nature of things, to use existential language, man and his condition on earth. From there, the tragedy comes out, and this tragedy in the inner world gives rise to the surreal, because the real is unbearable, the real is limited, and therefore much of human mind operates in the surreal because it knows the difficulties of the real and they are unbearable. It gives rise to dreams and fantasies, gives rise to eternus feminis, the dream figure of the ideal woman in men and eternal masculinus in women. It gives rise to art, and in a psychoanalytic sense, therefore, art is masturbation because the real thing cannot be had. Because you cannot have unconditional love in reality, you have it in art. So, in that sense, art is masturbation from a psychoanalytic standpoint. It leads to an endless struggle with everyone, trying to convert everyone into the ideal figure. And this leads to a situation where there's everyone against everyone. Everyone in search of the perfect other, leading to everyone against everyone. Everyone is also against everyone because of the struggle for what can take you nearest to the state of happiness and omnipotence. It gives rise to the ceaseless search, a restlessness, a disappointment, and sadness. In a psychoanalytic sense, it also gives rise to spirituality. So the tragedy has outcomes. Tragedy of the nature of things as it is has outcomes in the psychoanalytic sense and also in the spiritual sense. Uh, it gives rise to spirituality, a search in the spiritual domain. How does it play out at its extreme form in psychoanalysis? It plays out in the form of deep frustration, repeated frustration, giving rise to anger and sadness. This frustration repeated gives rise to disappointment, further on to hopelessness, and finally resignation. And this becomes one of the roots to depression, especially during the midlife crisis. Those who want more on it can go through our discussion on midlife crisis. And there's one discussion on this topic of disappointment and resignation. It can also lead to isolation of affect, in some cases psychosis, because reality acceptance becomes impossible, and therefore you have to create your own reality. And reality acceptance takes a new flavor because now you are saying write off everyone in search of an absolute. But don't give up the search. Don't go into psychosis. Don't go into depression. Don't go into a resignation. Be hopeful, be motivated, be joyful. Post writing off everyone. That's not an easy thing to do. But if we can, then we get into a positive depressive position, which I would like to call integration position rather than a depressive position. So there is a split position and an integration position. I would rather put the split position as disassociated position. So I would rather use a disassociated state or a contradictory state and an integrated state. And put paranoid schizoid position as one example of that disjointed state, and depressive position as one specific example of the integrated state. And it leads to a point in psychoanalysis where we say there is nowhere to go, and that leads to a reality acceptance. Now, this is a double root thing. There is nowhere to go in psychoanalysis will lead to reality acceptance, and there is nowhere to go in spirituality, will lead to a situation of the way out is in, as Sadhguru says, or what Indian spirituality says, there is nowhere to go but right in the moment. So this leads to two different flavors. There is nowhere to go. In spirituality, writing of humanity leads to a search of absolute, a search of God. In many spiritual schools, deep frustration and deep disappointment with other human beings is an inevitable and a necessary part of evolution in the spiritual process. In that fundamental and intense disappointment and resignation, deep-seated spiritual changes happens and deep-seated renunciation happens. And a deep-seated giving up of object-based happiness happens, and one moves into a causeless state of bliss. Spirituality can also take us into the realm of the surreal, where one is relating to non-human psycho-spiritual entities. It may be devis, it may be devtas, it may be something else, but it is a non-human relating, a non-real relating. From Western DSM standpoint, it's almost like a pre-psychosis, but that's a limitation of DSM which has not gone into which has not covered actually or not engaged with even the whole arena of spiritual experiences, spiritual processes, and the outcomes of spiritual processes. Enlightenment being the goal of spirituality, there is nowhere to go but in the moment into a state of no thought. And this often happens after deep repeated disappointments and writing off of humanity. Till you don't write off, you keep searching for somebody who can fulfill your life. Until then, you cannot be free from human entanglements. So the spiritual ladder has steps of disappointments, and one of the steps near the end of the ladder is of writing of humanity. So we have tried to cover writing of humanity from psychoanalytic and spiritual standpoint, taken a start from philosophy, and therefore writing of humanity is not necessarily pessimistic or aggressive. It can also be realistic, it can also be spiritual, and it's an important concept both in theory and in practice for both psychoanalysis and spirituality. Thank you.